Right, okay, so hello everyone. It's been a while I haven't posted videos because I'm quite busy at work at the moment. But I thought it was a good opportunity to post a short discussion video on a recent, let's say, polemic online. And that's related, of course, to science. And this is a debate, discussion, um, or disagreement between Sabine Hossenfelder and a YouTuber called Professor Dave. And so I just would like to address some of the criticism and claims or viewpoint being put forward by this Professor Dave. Um, I, I said from the get-go, I tend to disagree with his viewpoint, but also while I agree with the main point that Sabine Hossenfelder is making, I don't agree for the reason she's putting forward. Okay, so let's have a quick look at this video. We're not going to look at it in all, but just
Hey
to have a
everyone,
go.
so most of you saw my video last week on Sabine Hossenfelder. The response was mixed, but its detractors clearly missed the point of the video, so we now have to clarify some things. Let's get into it. Now, I'm used to science deniers watching little to none of a particular video only to yell at me in the comments section, but I've never seen this behavior from so many academics. It really is appalling. Every single person who acted as though the theme of my video was academia is perfect, prompting them to launch into novella-length rants about all the problems they've encountered in academia, needs to go and take a long look in the mirror. Let me give you the brief version of what you all missed. This. Thumbnails that say, I don't trust scientists. That's the problem with Sabina. Incredibly unprofessional, damaging clickbait thumbnails like this. And statements like this.
Most of academic research that your taxes pay for is almost certainly bullshit.
That's a ridiculous and totally indefensible statement that fuels science denial. What's that? Oh, Dave chopped out a...
So, I mean, just in these few kind of seconds, there are a few things to say. So, the problem, I think, so Professor Dave is complaining that academics actually agree with Sabine Hossenfelder that there is a problem with academia. Now, then Professor Dave says that he's not defending academia. But the problem is that he is defending something that he calls science, as if there is one thing called science, and basically what other thing than academia is actually related to scientific production is difficult to imagine. There is, of course, science being produced by private companies, but here I'm sure Professor Dave would agree that it's always a gray area because there are vested interests that may be at play there. So the most neutral notion of an apolitical notion of science with some sort of big S is actually academia. So it's not like it's a surprise that people appear to disagree with Professor Dave on that particular point. Let's continue here. Sabine Hossenfelder mentioned that most science that was produced is probably bullshit. Now, Professor Dave probably knows that there is a quite recent paper, not recent anymore, maybe 5-year-old or a bit older, by Ioannidis from the US, who did publish in various occasions various viewpoints. So he's one of the most cited researchers in medical science, and he mentioned multiple times that a huge part of the research published in medicine was bullshit. I will try to retrieve because it could be it's a bit more nuanced than this. Maybe, I'm not sure. So I'm going to find the article and then put it as a link, but also maybe put in the edited version of the video. Okay, so that's something to be aware of. It's not like she took this from necessarily, she pulled it out of her hat. It could be that that comes from various claims that have been made in various scientific circles.
Of super important context? No, I didn't. This is what I played in my video that so many of you didn't watch.
But I knew it was bullshit, just as most of the work in that area is currently bullshit, and just as most of academic research that your taxes pay for is almost certainly bullshit.
Most of the work in a particular area, followed by an additional statement about academic research in general. She is talking about all academic research, including all the fields which aren't physics that she knows absolutely nothing about.
Yeah, so here Professor Dave is obviously right. Let's be clear here. I'm not defending Sabine Hossenfelder. She has a quite aggressive style of communication, not too dissimilar to, in fact, Professor Dave. And so here I'm not defending, in fact, anyone. I agree with Professor Dave that she's essentially committing what is called a generalization fallacy. She's making a statement which is her opinion about a particular subject and then generalizing that opinion to everything else. And so in that case, I think it's perfectly fair from Professor Dave to point this out, and that's perfectly correct. One of the things that, however, have to be mentioned is that there are few fields that people can look at and that are relevant for things like health and so on, that are worth investigating, and where there is known evidence that there are at least viewpoints within the community that most of the published work is rubbish. So this is something at least to be aware of. So it's not like these things again come from ab nihilo, but it's true that what she's doing in this particular video is a generalization fallacy.
So no, she is not exclusively talking about theoretical physics. She can insist
Yes, so
that's what
correct.
she meant in retrospect, but it's not
on.
what she said. She's lying. So I'm sorry, there is nothing for science deniers to misinterpret. All of the hundreds of...
Well, we need to be a bit careful with what lying means. I think she's committing a fallacy. But we need to be careful about what lying means. So lying is basically saying something that we know to be false. Okay, stating something as true that we know to be false or that we believe to be false. And so we don't know whether actually she believes that what she says is false. So that's not lying, but that could be something incorrect and something that is a fallacy. And I agree again with this. About this particular argument with Professor Dave.
Who complained about how it's not her fault if science deniers twist her words in zany ways. You can kindly eat your own words. They are twisting nothing. She tells science deniers exactly what they want to hear, which is why they've begun watching her.
So of course, here just to mention, Professor Dave uses this so-called science denier thing. I don't know what he means by that. He's going to try to attempt to clarify this a bit later. This is not going to help his case. I think the use of the term science denier is what most people in fact criticized in his first video. It's a blanket statement that is completely vacuous, and because it's a tag that is vacuous and doesn't make any sense, that we can ascribe to anyone we want, essentially it becomes completely meaningless.
In huge numbers, which is why she continues catering to them. That's the problem with Sabine as of late, and that's what I was...
So here he's making a very big claim, and in fact, I must say, without any evidence. So he's claiming two things, that A, she is lying, which unless he is in her head, he doesn't know. Making an incorrect statement is not lying, is making an incorrect statement, and that's it. And then he's actually affirming very assertively as he's used to, that she's doing this only for money. Now, we need to be clear that this is her job now. She has quit academia, as far as I understand, and she obviously needs, to live, and so she needs money. Well, there's some sound apologies, but so she needs money. Okay, that's true. But the fact that she's saying the things she says for money, I think, is something that he has no particular evidence for. Okay, unless he has any kind of secret tape where she says, "Oh, we need to absolutely say that this is going to give many views, and these many views are going to give me a lot of money," then this is not something that we can infer simply because she has catchy headlines and catchy titles. In fact, if he actually read any of the articles she writes, she's very good with words, and in fact with having catchy kind of titles and stuff like that, even when it's not related to money. So she has this usual kind of habit with words, let's say, and she has this. She's provocative essentially. So that's just a character. She, as Dave may know, Professor Dave or whatever he wants to call himself, may know, she's a singer, she's an artist, and basically that's part of a persona. So I would not necessarily infer from this that this is all for money. So that's completely unwarranted on Professor Dave's part.
Talking about in the video you didn't watch. Because so many people felt compelled to rant exclusively about academia, we're going to talk about academia in a moment. As I said very little about it in my previous video, but it seems...
So it's funny because I'm not going to look at this passage. It's a nice passage where he talks about many problems in academia related to the publication process, related to various pressures to publish and all that. But I'm not going to look at this. So there are two reasons for that. First, because he uses one particular article that somehow manages to criticize and essentially salvage academia or what comes out of academia. So it's a sort of, yes, I agree, but not so much kind of narrative. Second, as far as I'm aware, and I may be wrong, and probably somebody is going to correct me if that's the case, but Professor Dave has not practiced in academia. He is not an academic. And contrary to Sabine Hossenfelder and people like me and others, if you've got unorthodox ideas, then you've got way more difficulties to publish even valid arguments, valid scientific arguments and theories or perhaps interpretations of experiments and so on, than if you are in the orthodoxy part of it. In fact, very commonly, you've got a certain, let's say, former sites that are called preprint sites, like Archive. I think that is hosted by Cornell University, that essentially now request of you to have various kind of permissions or endorsements by renowned people to actually publish on their website. And this is a bit, to be honest, silly and ridiculous. And they also reserve the right to remove, without actually any say about it, to remove publications they're not happy with because they are not orthodox enough. There are various examples in the field of astrophysics. On the Med archive, there are obviously examples in medicine. There are examples in education, so in the education science as well, and so on and so forth. So being outside of the orthodoxy and doing research in this particular context is very, very tough. And that's why, in fact, Sabine Hossenfelder is very bitter about it. Of course, this is plain to see for anyone listening to her, but she is right to being bitter. And Professor Dave, apart from a sort of essentially reading off a script, doesn't know academia. As far as I'm aware, I think later in the video, which I'm not going to go to, he does mention that he is not in academia. So I think it's nice to read one particular review that happens to have a sort of mild criticism of the academic system, but then we need to be aware that there are a lot of censorship within academia that is caused by various journals and editorial policies, and in fact, a lot of self censorship as well. In fact, that's not even mentioned in the critic that is put forward by Professor Dave. So, if you're interested, I do have a video that looks at censorship in academia, in publishing, and I discussed these things. So it's one article, so it's just one article as well. So I'm not going to claim that this is kind of more than the article proposed by Professor Dave, but the article proposed by Professor Dave was not a research article. It was a sort of summarizing piece and kind of opinion piece about these kind of things. So there is on the one hand a sort of data, and then from this data there is various opinions coming out of it. So it's a nice thing that he says. Again, I'm not going necessarily to talk about this in great details. In fact, not at all. The thing is that one of the issues, as we are going to see,
influence the course of science, just ignore them. It is astounding how wrong this person is. It's not a...
It's amazing how affirmative and assertive this Professor Dave is. Like, it's really... I wonder if there is any situation where Professor Dave has been wrong, or at least would be willing to say that they have been wrong, that he has been wrong at some point. If you look at some of the former videos, maybe in the last 2 or 3 months, that were done by Sabine Hossenfelder, however arrogant she may sound in some situations and provocative, many of actually her so-called clickbait titles start by "I was wrong about this," and "I was wrong about that," or "I didn't know this," or "I didn't know that." I wonder when is the last time a video like this was posted by Professor Dave. Okay, so let's continue.
About academia, it's about society as a whole.
So here it's important really, because what we realize is that the video is not about science. And that's really the crux of the problem. The video for Professor Dave is not about science, it's about society. It's a political problem. And then the main view being developed here is basically that if somehow we don't have a sort of... I can't put it differently from saying blind trust in institutionalized science, then society crumbles. That's kind of the point being put forward. Let's continue a little bit.
These people vote. They bring people into office who enact legislation that steers nations towards fascism and theocracy. This is
right. So let's have a look at history. If Dave is fine with this. So in history, okay, one of the most scientifically advanced and with an incredible knowledge of science, and with a society that was grounded in orthodoxy and orthodox science of the time, is actually Nazi Germany. And that was in the time where eugenism was actually the orthodoxy to talk about people and about how to make social restructuring and so on. So I'm not too sure, for example, that being against the orthodoxy is always an issue, and doubting or not trusting some scientists that are eminent scientists, but that are basically institutionalized, is a bad thing. So Nazi Germany is obviously one particular point. I don't know what is the point of view of Professor Dave about essentially the Soviet Union. He probably knows that the whole point of the Soviet Union was a scientification, I'm not too sure how to put that, of everything, okay? And so everything was viewed through the lenses of science, institutionalized science, and basically what has become orthodox science in Soviet Union. Things could probably be, of course, criticized to some extent, okay, but within the limitations of being in agreement with the party line, etc. But that's part of what it means to be to mix essentially politics with science, and that's really what Professor Dave is doing, is politicizing science, claiming that somebody who refuses to essentially trust a sort of institutionalized, governmentalized scientific claim is a problem. No, that's not the case. In fact, in the past, let's be clear, in the past, fascism has arisen, I should say, from basically institutionalized science, not the other way around. So please revise your history, Dave.
About academia. It's about populism and culture wars. Despite what anyone may claim, it is specifically the duty of the science community.
So what is the duty of science communicators? Is actually to talk about science. There is no, first of all, I'm not sure there is any contract that somehow you need to talk about certain scientific stories rather than others. So it's a choice by Professor Dave to talk about institutionalized science, or what some people could call the scientific canon. That's basically his choice. Scientific communicators can talk about plenty of things, including scientific disagreement. Okay, and in fact, that's what Sabine Hossenfelder does, and that's great because Professor Dave talks about the orthodoxy and communicates, and he's a good propagandist when it comes to scientific orthodoxy. Great job, Dave, fantastic. But then Sabine Hossenfelder is very good as well at basically essentially talking about alternative scientific narratives that are equally scientific. It's not because they are not part of some canon decided by nobody knows that basically this is not science, unless Professor Dave has some criterion that are unknown to most scientists about what it means to do science, that kind of doesn't fit the bill. Okay, so there are different kinds of science communicators. Some of them talk about orthodox science, fair enough. Some others talk about the disagreements within science, and that's it. End of the game. And indeed, if both types of content are allowed, then it's basically how science should be communicated about. Nothing wrong with this.
To help the public understand science and
yes, all science, including people disagreeing with each other, which is essentially the bread and butter of scientists, disagreeing with each other.
Scientific community in such a way that they are immunized against this influence. They should not be themselves contributing poisonous rhetoric that fuel.
No, not trusting scientists is not poisonous rhetoric, Professor Dave. That's normal scientific behavior. There is no reason to trust, in fact, anyone. And in fact, the only problem here, you could argue, is the kind of injunction of don't trust scientists. The problem is that people should be free to trust whoever they want. If they want to trust scientists, if they want to trust Professor Dave, if they want to trust Sabine Hossenfelder, then so be it. We are, I believe, in free countries, and so people have the freedom of believing, what they feel they want to believe in. Okay, that's what happens in free countries. If Professor Dave is not happy with these kind of things, then maybe he wants to move in a different country with different kind of ideals. So that's kind of the first point. The second point is, of course, claiming that it's not okay to not trust scientists is very strange, because that's the basics of science. Science is about doubt. Some people would put it, for example, into or ground it into the Cartesian doubt. Cartesian doubt is to the extent that you doubt your own existence, and then you start from there to build foundations about things you can be let's say, confident about. Okay. Now, I'm not sure whether Professor Dave has ever doubted about his own existence, but the bottom line here is that not trusting something because you're told that you should trust it is a basic tenet of scientific endeavor. So I'm not too sure where Dave is going there, because that's a perfectly fine statement to say that this is not something that should be done necessarily. Okay, trusting scientists. In fact, trusting anyone. Okay, why should you trust politicians? Why should you trust doctors? This is something that you lend to others on your own account, at least in a free country. Okay, so that's the idea. I'm not too sure again why Professor Dave wants to impose us that somehow it's not okay to not trust scientists. I'm not too sure. And it could be, by the way, and that's often the case, that people simply choose the scientists they want to trust. So, for example, let's say they decide not to trust Professor Dave, but they decide to trust Sabine Hossenfelder. Does that make them science deniers? Probably not, right? Because they trust a scientist. So it's not like there is no nuance to this thing. Like Professor Dave is trying to tell us that somehow they are going to trust no scientist whatsoever, which is usually not the case. They simply don't trust the one apparently Professor Dave would like us to trust, but that's a different story.
Science denial among the public. I can't possibly have been more clear about this in my other video. When you plant a seed of anti-establishment bias in a person, it will inevitably rear its ugly head in the form of rejecting scientific consensus on any...
So scientific consensus, let me please say it, is bullshit, okay? I think Professor Dave should look at, maybe Professor Dave has read the structure of scientific revolutions and various works from philosophers of science and sociologists of science. But clearly, consensus cannot be a means to determine whether something should be trusted or not. Okay, I'm happy actually to provide plenty of examples. I've got plenty in my pocket, but that would be in a different video. But clearly, so just quickly, the point is, I'm just going to quote, just for that particular statement, I'm going to quote Planck. The actual quote itself, maybe I will put it somewhere in the edit of the video. But essentially, the point is that Planck was stating that science progresses not because eventually the scientist sees the light and they kind of understand that they were in the wrong because the new ideas are better. It's just that eventually the people who are opposed to the ideas, they simply die out, and somehow the new ones, the seeds of the new ones, have been essentially introduced through education. And then the new people coming in are actually more, they lend themselves more to be aligned with the new kind of ideas than the old ones, and basically that's how science kind of move forward. Okay, so that's a typical statement that was made again in the early 20th century, so it's not something super new either, and that probably Professor Dave knows. So consensus doesn't mean anything in science. In fact, I think Professor Dave probably would have said in many cases that science is not a democratic thing. You can be wrong even if everybody, you can be right even if everybody is against you. You can cite people like Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, whoever you want. Essentially, that's kind of traditional scientific mythology, that scientific consensus is of no bearing on the actual scientific merit.
Other matter imaginable, and in ways that produce quantifiable harm or even elevated death tolls.
Yeah, so here these are opinions and speculations that Professor Dave apparently likes to put forward. Fair
in
enough.
Situations like a pandemic or other events that pose an existential threat to humanity. People who make
Right. So can Professor Dave tell us the number of casualties that have been caused or death by asbestos? right? So asbestos was part of a very nice material that everybody told was safe, and now many people are dying from cancer and from other kind of deterioration of the surrounding parts of the lungs. So that's one example. Okay, there are various scandals that have taken place in the US and in other places that were caused by precisely institutionalized science that people were told to trust blindly, and that ended up in actually tons of death, and that could have been prevented if people had not trusted institutionalized science. That's just one example among many. Of course, in the UK and in Europe, there is a very common, not common, we've got a common dramatic event, where blood being used for transfusion in the 1980s was actually contaminated with HIV. Now the thing is that the tools that were used for testing HIV at the time were not really good, and so people were not sure whether the blood was contaminated or not. But they had very strong suspicion, and that was at the institutionalized medical research and practice level. And what happened is that the medical institutions of the time in Europe and in the UK, they simply decided to continue to transfuse people with this contaminated blood. So that's called the contaminated blood scandal. And the blood, by the way, was coming from the US, and it was contaminated. Like thousands and thousands of people have died from that. So the thing is that it's fine for Professor Dave to giving lessons in like very authoritative fashion, but there are a plethora of situations where essentially things have clearly gone wrong, and people were told not to basically budge or to trust the science or to trust the institution, and they were wrong in doing so. So again, I'm not too sure where Professor Dave is going with this.
That feeds conspiracy will amplify societal problems.
No, it's not a conspiracy, Dave. These things have happened. They've been reported by journalists. They've been reported by whistleblowers. I'm not too sure, again, where this is going.
Bad science communication enables bad faith act.
So it is true that some people have this idea that scientists are all paid, including in academia, and they lie to you. I think that's indeed a simplistic narrative. What happens is that usually scientists are just clueless. They are brainwashed because they have simply followed the rules, they followed the lessons, they followed the textbook, and they were very good at following the textbook. That's what scientists are, right? They are very good at following textbooks. They assimilate very fast. They are able, exactly like Professor Dave, to parrot very assertively things they've learned. And at the end of the day, then they just believe everything they've learned. And that's it. And they don't have any introspection or critical outlook about what they've learned. And usually, to be honest, the only way to get such a critical outlook is A, to actually go into research, and B, have a little bit of humility. But again, I'm not too sure Professor Dave has any of these attributes.
In the culture war, which polarizes the public against science. That was the point of my video, not academia is perfect.
No, again, I don't think it polarizes people against science. There are so many scientists that have different views and opinions. It's just that people are going to not agree with the scientist that Professor Dave agrees with, and they are going to agree with others. That's just the difference.
This comment everyone is salivating over, as well as the several dozen below it, perfectly encapsulate how these critics did not understand what I said and did not watch the whole video. A person who exclusively does what these
let's move on.
Because that's another because of a disproportionate number of retracted papers.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Because of this, scientists are rethinking
so that's a part on academia.
Due to the actions of these other few. Let's look to this PNAS paper on scientific progress despite irreproducibility. The so-called replication crisis, of course, is another favorite talk.
So we need to be careful when we talk about scientific progress, irreproducibility, and stuff like that. We need to be a bit careful. The paper is obviously very interesting, but essentially this is a sort of viewpoint. Okay, the people who wrote this particular paper say that there is a problem perhaps with irreproducibility, but then nonetheless scientific progress can still occur. And of course, plenty of things do happen, etc. And in fact, Professor Dave is right. There are tons and tons of papers that come out every single day. And in fact, the vast majority of them are not discussed by Professor Dave. And the vast majority of them may actually be contradicting things that Professor Dave is talking about. And maybe this criticizing part of the research is part of the progress that maybe Professor Dave is not aware of. So it's a bit complicated. Many of these papers would probably disagree or put a lot of nuance on many of the assertive claims made by Professor Dave.
Point of so many, which hardly applies to the physical sciences, but let's highlight some key takeaways. First, given the enormous volume of scientific output, it is not necessary for every paper to be groundbreaking for a field to progress. Regarding neuroscience,
so
for
let's
example,
have a look at this
ultimately destructive. The intent must be shifted towards helping the public understand how the advancements outweigh the problems by orders of magnitude in nearly every sector of public life.
I disagree. I completely disagree. So can Professor Dave explain to us how microplastics in living tissues and water has actually improved the public life? So what the hell is he talking about here? Who is deciding actually how or whether these progresses are positively impacting our lives, and whether the cost of, let's say, getting cancer or brain kind of damage or lesion is actually necessary cost for the benefit of using whatever plastic cups or something like this. Who is to actually determine this? In my opinion, clearly not Professor Dave, and that's a political issue, and in fact an individual issue. Everyone should be able to determine for themselves whether this is something that is worth the cost, not Professor Dave. And if Professor Dave believed that the role of science communicators is to make people understand how essentially these costs are worth it, then I'm not sure it's a science communicator anymore. It's basically just, I'm not too sure actually. Propagandist would be a better word. That's it. So let's move on.
Despite the propaganda and science denial that would tell you otherwise.
You're doing the propaganda.
And for all those who complained about my use of this term, science denial, I just don't know what you're upset about. The term is self-explanatory. For example,
No, it's not self-explanatory at all. Clearly not.
Has shown conclusively that COVID vaccines did not produce significantly more adverse reactions than other vaccines in widespread usage, and also saved millions of lives.
Well, that's a very strange statement to make. I mean, some vaccines have been pulled. It's a very weird statement to make. It does not produce more side effects than some other vaccines or whatever. First of all, what does that mean? Second of all, many vaccines, and you can check, have been removed from distribution, and they have not been proposed as interventions anymore, because they cause too many side effects. So I'm not too sure where Professor Dave is going here. We also need to check, I didn't check to be honest, who actually did this particular study. We need to make sure that people who did that particular study have no vested interest, so for example did not fund, contributed to the policy making of any of the measures here. So I see, for example, that it's a study from perhaps WHO. So these are things that need to be checked in terms of potential vested interest as well. Now again, this idea that somehow there is a sort of a single number that is going to tell us about typical effects of vaccines, typical frequency of side effects, and that we can compare it to these new ones is strange. It just depends on the kind of vaccines that people have, which ones, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, I'm going to put some of the links there, but probably Professor Dave knows that the AstraZeneca, for example, vaccine was basically pulled in various countries in Europe after a few months of use, in Germany, in France, I believe in Belgium, and then I think across the EU afterwards. There are various issues that were happening as well with the manufacturing of the AstraZeneca vaccines that were even recognized by the team that partly developed it at Oxford. So it's very strange. Likewise, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was eventually pulled out. So it's kind of strange what Professor Dave is saying here, because some vaccines of the COVID era have been eventually pulled by various health institutions. I think in Germany they are starting to, in fact, reimburse to basically people who had their health coincidentally damaged after injection. So again, I'm not too sure where Professor Dave is going there. In fact, here, if anything, he raises an ethical problem. And this ethical problem is that if we admit that any medical intervention has side effects, that here we acknowledge that these side effects do exist in COVID vaccines, then the problem is how do we rationalize the enforcement of these interventions on some categories of population. I think that's an ethical problem to be put forward that I'm sure Professor Dave can think about, and I'm sure can make a very great video about. But in any case, it's not because somebody doesn't trust, for example, this particular publication, or append this particular publication with additional research that has been done. For example, there's been research done in Switzerland on the efficacy and various side effects related to vaccination. There's been a recent study on the frequency of myocarditis in young, I think in children, compared with the rates with the disease, and so on and so forth. So it's the reason why people again disagree here is not because some of the logic is wrong. It's just because you can't show a paper and then say that if you disagree with that particular paper or have additional evidence that might put some nuance to that particular paper, then somehow you don't trust the science. That's a very, very simplistic view, and I think that's a strategy. That's a strategy, a debating strategy that is used to convince others. Nothing else. It's just a strategy to convince others. It's snake oil kind of strategy. To convince others, cherry picking one study and saying that if there is more to the story than this particular study, then you're a science denier. I think you can do better than this, Professor Dave. I'm going to stop here because the rest of it is basically non-interesting to me, at least. Rant about Sabine Hossenfelder. And the reason why I don't find it interesting is because I mostly agree on most accounts with Professor Dave. Although I wouldn't use the words that he's using, I think that she is provocative. That's part of her persona that I don't necessarily like very much, but that's how she is, and that's it. Now ranting about it for 20 minutes, I think is a bit too much for me. So basically, that's it about my opinion on this. My view is that people should trust whoever they want to trust, again, in a free country. And it's perfectly fine and even sane, I would say, to not trust scientists. And in fact, if anything, people should try to read as much as possible the publications that come out if they want to make their own minds about something. I don't see why people need someone else to make their mind about something. If the paper or the publication is too technical, they may forego that particular right to have their own opinion. But then they choose whomever they want to actually, let's say, delegate that opinion making action. And I don't see why they would necessarily agree with Professor Dave for every single question. So basically, that's it. I think I'm pretty clear that I disagree with the fact that we should. I disagree with the fact that no, we should trust the science. Blah, blah. I think that's not that simple. And institutionalized science has shown a lot of problems beyond the academic problems mentioned related to publications and so on.